Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah, welcome.
We're going to be diving into human rights.
Human rights. Yeah.
And it's something that I think a lot of people hear and they think,
Right.
oh, like a very basic thing, or I already know about that. But
Yeah, you think you do.
we're gonna go a little deeper, hopefully.
Yeah, we're going to complicate it.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Yeah, in the best way possible.
Hopefully a fun way.
Hopefully a fun way, exactly. So to do this, we have three sources
Okay.
that we're going to be looking at today. One of them is about Hannah Arendt,
Okay.
who is a philosopher who had some really, really interesting thoughts about the very nature of rights.
Yeah, and she should know, given her own experiences.
Yeah, definitely.
It really shaped her thinking.
And then we're going to be looking at Hofeld.
Hofeld. Now, there was a lawyer who really knew how to break things down.
Yes, exactly.
Get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, I think he was a little too into categories, personally.
Maybe, but sometimes you need those categories. It's like organizing your tools.
I guess so. Keeps things tidy.
Exactly.
Okay, and then lastly, we're going to be looking at kind of just the more traditional conception of human rights.
Right, that kind of common understanding, the baseline a lot of people start from.
Yeah, kind of breaking down the assumptions that we all have about it.
Yeah, because even those common assumptions have a history, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so should we just jump right in?
Let's do it. Where should we start?
Let's start with Hannah Arendt.
Okay, all right.
So Hannah Arendt was a philosopher
Right.
who really kind of had to deal with this idea of human rights, I guess, on a very personal level,
Right.
because she was a refugee.
Yeah, fleeing Nazi Germany in the 1930s.
So not some abstract thought experiment for her.
Exactly. This was her life.
And so what she really focused on, I think, was this idea of, you always hear, oh, human rights, they're universal.
Right, they apply to everyone equally, just because you're human.
But she saw a huge problem with that idea.
A huge problem, yeah. Because if they truly were universal, then why weren't they being protected?
Yeah, and I think World War II was like
Exactly. I mean, that was her whole point.
the ultimate example of that.
The Holocaust, the persecution of minorities, it showed the tragic limits of just assuming everyone would agree on these rights.
And so she really pushed this idea of the right to have rights.
Yes.
Right. Yes.
The right to have
Right.
rights. Because for her, it wasn't enough to say, oh, these rights exist in theory.
Right. They had to mean something in the real world.
You need a system, a community, a framework where those rights are actually guaranteed and protected. Otherwise, they're just words on paper.
So it's not enough to just be born human. You also have to belong somewhere that recognizes and upholds those rights.
Exactly. And tragically, that's what was missing for so many people, especially after World War II.
Right. Millions of refugees.
Millions of people with no home, no citizenship, no framework to claim those rights, even if everyone agreed they had them in principle.
It's like falling through the cracks of the system.
Exactly. And that's where her ideas become so relevant, even today.
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about the modern refugee crisis.
We're still grappling with these same questions. Who gets to belong? Whose rights are protected? And how do we create a system that truly upholds the dignity of every human being?
Yeah. Some really heavy stuff to think about.
It is, but it's important. And luckily, we have thinkers like Arendt to help us grapple with these complex issues.
Yeah.
Really heavy stuff.
But, luckily we have other thinkers too who can help us make sense of all this.
Yeah, and that's a perfect transition because I kind of want to bring in Hofeld now.
Okay. Hofeld.
Yeah, because this is where I think things get really, really interesting,
Okay.
but also potentially very confusing.
Yeah.
So Hofeld was all about taking this idea of a right
Right.
and breaking it down
Yes. Breaking it down into smaller parts.
into these like very specific, very
Incidents.
incidents.
Yeah, he called them incidents. Yes. Incidents? I was going to say like elements or components,
Yeah,
but
you use the incidents.
incidents is the word.
It's more precise.
More precise.
Yeah, he was all about precision.
So I think for me,
Okay.
the easiest way to think about this is like, when you're trying to understand like a machine
Okay, yeah.
and you've got to like break it down into its individual parts.
Right, like taking it apart to see how it works.
Yeah, to see how all the parts work together.
Exact.
That's what Hofeld is doing with rights.
Mhm.
He's saying, okay, we keep talking about this word right,
Yeah,
but what does it actually mean?
exactly. What are the nuts and bolts?
What are the nuts and bolts of a right?
Yeah.
And so he breaks it down into these and he's got 8 of them, but we're only going to talk about a few of them.
Right. We'll stick to the most relevant ones.
The most relevant ones. Okay, so I guess the first ones that he talks about really are these ideas of claim rights
Okay. Claim rights.
and duties.
Duties, right. And those two always go together. They're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, so it's like I have a claim right to something
Right.
if you have a duty to give it to me.
Right, exactly. So, for example, if you work, you have a right to be paid for that work. That's your claim, right?
Right.
And your employer, on the flip side, has a duty to pay you.
Yes, exactly. So one can't exist without the other.
Precisely. It's a two-way street.
Okay, so we got claim rights and duties. Those are like our first two little incidents.
Right, our first two building blocks.
Yes.
Okay.
And then what else we got?
Then we've got liberties.
Liberties.
And liberties are all about what you're free to do without anyone interfering.
So my freedom to walk down the street and
Freedom of speech.
freedom of speech, freedom of
religion.
all of those things that fall under that umbrella of you're free to do this as long as it's not harming anyone else.
Right. So it's like what I'm allowed to do without someone telling me I can't. Exactly. It's about your personal sphere of freedom.
Okay, so we got claim rights, duties, liberties.
Right. And for our next trick, we'll add powers to the mix.
Powers. Okay.
A power is the ability to change someone else's legal position.
Ooh, okay. So it's like if I have the power to give you something.
Exactly. Like imagine you have property and you write a will. You have the power to give that property to someone else when you die.
Oh, okay. So I'm changing their legal rights.
Exactly. You're changing their legal position by giving them that property. They now have rights and potentially duties that come with owning that property.
Okay, so it's about shifting those legal relationships, giving someone new rights or responsibilities.
Precisely. You got it.
Okay, I think I'm getting this. This is fun.
See? Legal Lego.
Legal Lego, I told you. Okay, what else?
Okay, last but not least, we have immunities.
Immunities. That sounds important.
It is. Think of it like a shield. It means you're protected from having your rights changed by someone else.
So like diplomatic immunity.
Exactly. A diplomat can't be arrested or prosecuted in a foreign country. They have immunity from those actions.
So it's like having a special status that protects your rights in certain situations.
Exactly. You've got it. And there are other kinds of immunities too, but that's the general idea.
So we've got claim rights, duties, liberties, powers, and immunities. That's our Hofeldian toolkit.
Exactly. And you know what the best part is?
What's that?
Now we can use these tools to analyze all sorts of real-world situations, like the refugee crisis we were talking about earlier.
Right. Because now we can start asking who has the claim right to seek asylum? Who has the duty to protect refugees?
Exactly. And who has the power to grant them those rights or the immunity to deny them?
Okay, so this is where things start to get really interesting, right? Because now we're not just talking about these concepts in the abstract. We're seeing how they play out in the real world with real consequences for real people.
Exactly. And that's what makes this stuff so important, because once you start to see these dynamics at play, you can't unsee them.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think that brings us to this idea of how human rights are commonly understood today.
Okay, so we've got art, we've got Holfeld.
Right, so we've got our foundation, kind of.
Our building blocks.
Yeah.
Okay.
But now we need to talk about this dominant view of human rights, this common conception that's out there in the world.
Because even though it might seem like common sense, it's important to remember that these ideas have a history too.
Totally. Yeah, and it's so easy to just take that common understanding for granted.
It really is. But like we've been saying, it's important to unpack those ideas to see where they come from and what their limitations might be.
Totally. So when we talk about this dominant view of human rights, what are we actually talking about? What are those core principles?
Well, I think the first and most central principle is this idea of universality.
Universality, okay.
Yeah, this means that human rights apply to everyone equally, simply by virtue of being human.
Okay, so it doesn't matter where you're from, what you believe, what you've done.
It doesn't matter. Everyone is entitled to these basic rights just because they're human.
Right, like it's inherent to our existence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because these rights are seen as inherent, they're also considered to be inalienable.
Inalienable, meaning?
Meaning they can't be taken away, no matter what.
Oh, okay, so even if someone commits a crime, like a really terrible crime.
Even then, they might lose certain privileges or freedoms as a consequence of their actions.
Right.
But those core human rights, those remain.
Wow. Okay, so that's universality and inalienability. What else?
Another big one is this focus on establishing minimum standards of treatment.
Minimum standards.
Yeah, so it's not about guaranteeing a life of perfect happiness or anything like that.
Right.
It's about protecting people from the worst kinds of abuses.
Okay, so it's like a safety net.
Exactly. A safety net to ensure that everyone is treated with a basic level of dignity and respect.
Makes sense.
And then, within this framework, states or governments are seen as the primary duty bearers when it comes to upholding these rights.
Okay, that makes sense because they have the power to make and enforce laws, right?
Exactly. They have the authority to create the conditions where human rights can actually be respected and protected.
But it's not just on governments, is it? I mean, we all have a role to play.
Absolutely. Individuals, organizations, businesses, we all have a responsibility to uphold human rights. But states are seen as having this special obligation because they have that power, that authority, to make a real difference.
Right, to create systemic change.
Exactly. Another point that often comes up is that human rights are generally given higher priority than other values.
Okay, so if there's a conflict, say, between economic interests and human rights,
Human rights should win out, in theory at least.
in theory, right, because obviously it doesn't always work out that way in the real world.
Unfortunately not,
Yeah.
which is something we'll definitely come back to. But for now, the last thing I'll say about this common conception is that it views human rights as being independent of positive law.
Independent of, okay, break that down for me.
So basically, it means that these rights exist whether or not a country's laws actually acknowledge them.
So even if a country doesn't have laws protecting freedom of speech, for example.
The right to freedom of speech still exists, regardless of what those laws say.
Wow, that's a powerful idea.
It is powerful, but it also highlights the limitations of this common conception.
Because if these rights exist independently of law, then how do we actually ensure they're being upheld?
Exactly. That's a
It's-
million-dollar question. And it's something that a lot of scholars and activists are grappling with.
Right, because it's one thing to say these rights exist on paper.
But it's another thing entirely to make them a reality in the lives of people around the world.
Totally. And I think that's something that Arne and Holfeld would both agree on, even though they came at this issue from very different angles.
Absolutely. They both understood that rights without a framework for protection are meaningless.
Exactly. And I think it's a good place to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the philosophical foundations of human rights to the practical challenges of making those rights a reality.
We've seen how these ideas have evolved over time and how they continue to be debated and challenged even today.
And most importantly, I think we've seen how relevant these issues are to all of our lives, whether we realize it or not.
Because ultimately, human rights are about our shared humanity. They're about recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every single person on this planet.
It's a lofty goal, but I think it's one worth striving for.
Absolutely. And I think these conversations, these deep dives, are a good place to start.
Totally agree. So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll catch you next time.